So Elizabeth Sutton Thompson, she was later become Lady Elizabeth Butler. But while I talk of her early paintings, and she was painting under the name Elizabeth Sutton Thompson, I'll refer to her as so. She achieved wealth, success, fame, as no female artist had ever achieved, all in the Victorian era. The Victorian era, of course, was the era which Queen Victoria was Queen of England, of Britain. The Victorian era, a time of great expansion, of great wealth in Britain. The cities grew, industry grew, technology grew, education grew, but with the belly of England swelling, so its underbelly grew too. Of course, there was terrible poverty in England and Britain, and 3/4 of the population were working class, were poor, and there was crime, there was disease, the slums grew. We all know our Dickens, and I think Dickens played it down. Victorian England was basically controlled by class and gender, and gender, of course, women were very much regarded as the chattel of men. They were a passive element of society as far as the patriarchal element were concerned. They were to lie back and think of England. A woman had very few legal rights. So, really to put it into context, it was considered improper for a woman to have knowledge of her body by the chattering classes, and if a woman had knowledge of how she gave birth, it was really not something a woman needed to know. Well, into this atmosphere, into these times, Elizabeth was born, and she chose for her life to be a military painter, and she became the first female military painter in the world. England has only one military painter, and it is a woman. Edouard d'Étal, the French military painter, said, which must have really upset the establishment in Britain when he said that. So her paintings, well, crowds actually fought to see her work. Police had to be called to keep the crowds back from the Royal Academy, to keep them from pushing in on her paintings. Galleries, collectors fought for her work. She was actually sued by galleries because on occasion she was not ready to show the work, and she had contracts with them. Really, to put it into context, I could say Lady Gaga or Madonna, in that her fame caused such outrage amongst the establishment. It was really considered not the done thing for a woman to have a profession, any profession, let alone military painting. She was a painter of violence. She was a colonial painter. She worked for the establishment, but she was more than that. She was one of the first social realist painters. And there wasn't actually, it seemed to be almost ignored by the establishment, but she was a social realist painter. The social realist painters were painters who painted life as it really was. So up until this stage, military paintings had been full of uniforms, of generals, of the generic soldier, the generic battle, shiny buttons, prestige. And she painted the battle from the working man's point of view. And of course, many people in the army, if not the majority of the rank and file, joined the army because they had no choice. It was the only way they could work. And she put this into her painting. She painted the individual man and the battle trauma that he suffered. And of course, remember, there was no TV, there was no films. The only visual art was music hall, theatre, dance, but painting. Painting was king, really. Great for us painters. Today her paintings are in the Tate Britain. Her paintings are in Tate Leeds. They're in the National Gallery, Melbourne, the National Army Museum, the Royal Collection, last but not least. And of course today she's regarded actually as a feminist icon. There was a play that toured in 2023 called Modest, and it was about gender roles being fluid. I mean, yes, it was about her fight to establish herself in the establishment as a female painter, but she was presented as an icon for the fight of gender fluidity. I'm not sure she'd have thought of that, but nevertheless, you know, she's still regarded as a feminist icon. I'll just read you what she said about war. She said, "My own reading of war, the mysteriously inevitable recurrence throughout the sorrowful existence of humanity, is that it calls forth the noblest and basest impulses of human nature. I never painted for the glory of war, but to portray its pathos and heroism." So in this lecture, I'm going to look at some of what I consider to be her best paintings. As I say, some of them are violent. Some of them did celebrate colonial Britain, but the majority of them were social realist paintings. And you'll see in the progression of her paintings, you'll see an artist's struggle to come to terms with her own consciousness and conscience. So, early childhood. Well, Elizabeth was born into a wealthy family, which is great for any artist. Her father inherited money on the condition that he did not work. So he brought up his children. He had two daughters, Elizabeth and her sister Alice, who also grew up to be a feminist icon, but of the day. She was a suffragette, and she was a published essayist, and very well known as a suffragette and also as a poet. She was a very famous poet in Victorian England. Her father dedicated his life to educating his girls. He educated them in, of course, the arts and English literature. She was obviously a historian, Elizabeth, and also languages. She spoke Italian, French, and the Catholic liturgy. She was a religious lady, and she always said that at one stage she came to a crossroads in her life, and she had to choose between religious paintings or military paintings. And she chose military paintings. I believe she was a very astute lady, and she had her eye on the cup. Well, from a young age, she was known to sketch, and she was drawn to painting military men. Her early sketchbooks are full of pictures of soldiers. Of course, at the time, throughout Europe, there were wars throughout Europe. Britain was involved in some sort of major offensive every 10 years for 100 years. And her sketchbooks are full of military men. She, at an early age, she enrolled in her mid-teens. She enrolled at the South Kensington School of Art. It was a South Kensington Female School of Art. There were two levels in the School of Art. There was elementary and there was advanced. The elementary level she found very unsatisfactory. There were art schools in every city and town in England at the time to cope with the demands of the Industrial Revolution. But she found that she was constantly being put to task, drawing, design, patterns. There was no fine art at all, no oil painting at all. She left the South Kensington Female School of Art and she travelled with her parents in Europe, which she did extensively throughout her childhood. And there she enrolled in an academy. Now, there are a few painters here, but I'm sure you're all aware that an art education was best got in the 19th century from the studios of artists. And she enrolled in a studio in Italy and studied with an artist the works of the great masters and their techniques. And she learned a lot there. She then returned to England and enrolled again in the Female School of Art, the South Kensington Female School of Art. And there she was at last admitted to the Life Room. Now, the Life Room was, you wouldn't believe the fuss over the Life Room in Victorian England, mainly because women were not allowed in Life Rooms, and female artists considered the Life Room a major part of their artistic education. And if I just show you, this is one of many petitions that was put to the artistic establishment. This went to the Royal Academy of Arts, and it was petitioning for the right to attend the Royal Academy of Arts. Women were not allowed to attend the Royal Academy of Arts until, I believe, 1880. A woman finally tricked her way in by signing her work with her initials and not putting Miss, and the Academy had to bring her in and accept her. But until then, women were not allowed to study at the Royal Academy of Arts because the Royal Academy said of their Life Rooms, nudity was not something women were allowed to be confronted with. And so they said that it's just not proper for a woman to study in a Life Room. Well, this unfortunately is slightly blurred, but it's quite extraordinary, really. These women are actually almost, they're so humble about their application to attend the Royal Academy. The Royal Academy refused. The petition refused to allow them in. This one was in 1863, an academician has written. There was further petitions. There was one in 1880 as well, asking just for the right to study. They said these ladies, and this petition, by the way, is from the South Kensington, the Female School of Art, the South Kensington School of Art, but it's also they circulated amongst all the art schools in the UK, and they just said, you know, how can we study art? How can we raise the calibre of art if we're not allowed to study it? The Royal Academy turned it down. Now, the Royal Academy today has 50-50 members, ladies and men, but then not so. So Elizabeth was determined to be a military painter right from the start, and she wrote in her sketchbook, on the first day at the Advanced Female School of Art, "They shall hear of me someday." Her father said he did not like her at all, being so absorbed by the military element, which he considered unsuitable for so young a girl, and her mother said that she detested war, though respecting deeply the heroism of the soldier, preferring her to espouse religious subjects. Well, she left art school and she started to achieve success almost immediately. She exhibited military watercolours, and they were exhibited outside London, and she entered into the Royal Academy. Every year the Royal Academy, accepts pictures, and say 6,000 entrants put in pictures, and she put in a painting called Missing, which I would love to show you, but it's missing from the public domain. But it is owned, and it's by a direct descendant of her owns it, the Gormansons. But anyway, it's there is you can see a copy of it. It is possible to see it, but it's not in the public domain. Anyway, so Missing was it showed her first painting, and it was two men lost in the Afghan hills with a horse, and these two men they're like two children clinging onto their horse. So right from the start, she was presenting this image of war, not that the men as the gallant hero, but as damaged individuals. And on the strength of Missing, she received a commission from Charles Galloway, who paid her £100. He allowed her, she could paint any subject she wanted. With the £100, she got herself a studio in 76 Fulham Road and set to work on a painting. And she chose as her subject a scene from the Crimea War. Now, the Crimea War was still fresh in the minds of the public. It was a victorious war for Britain, but it had been a war fought at great cost for the rank and file. And the papers were full of stories of this war, how it had been mismanaged by the officers, of how it was chaotic, of how men had fought in fog and rain and had no direction from high command. No orders were issued at all. And these men were fought hand to hand against Russian soldiers, outnumbered, surrounded. It was a terrible war for the men. And Elizabeth painted this, and we'll see it. Instead of presenting the men in a gallant light, she presented the roll call. Now, this is the men after a battle. And here we see a man lying dead. He appears to be dead, but his friend, he reaches out and is comforting him. Here we have a man, a non-commissioned officer, taking the roll call, wounded. We have this man here, wounded. We have all these men there. They're all look exhausted. None of them looking directly at the viewer. They've a little bit of the red jackets, but basically the men are in their dirty grey coats. And to the Victorian audience, they'd never seen a painting like this. They'd never been confronted with a line of men direct on. This was something very new. It was not this type of painting had not been exhibited before. Elizabeth wrote in her sketchbook, "I awoke the morning that this was exhibited and found myself famous." It was exhibited at eye level in room 2 in the academy. Now that's the best position pretty much you can get in the academy. When you walk into the academy, you walk into room 2, there's the painting. So this, for a woman to have this, was extraordinary. It must have set Victorian Britain chattering. The chattering classes must have been, the men would have been outraged, the women would have been excited. It really must have been quite something. But was it to be a new era for the dawn of an equality of the sexes? Would women be accepted now into the establishment of painting, of art? Would they be given an equal footing? It seemed like they might. Listen to what the Telegraph wrote. "The public saw a manacle hacked off a woman's wrist and a shackle knocked off her ankle. The woman artist will now be freed from wasting upon fruitless subjects the sympathies which could be developed for the advantage of humanity, while at the same time being endowed with a vocation which can be cultivated in her own home, without the risk of submission to any galling tyranny or more galling patronage." Well, I'm sure the irony wasn't wasted on her. The Times said, "There is no sign of a woman's weakness." And the Duke of Cambridge at the RA dinner, which women were not allowed to attend, said, "It is a mystery to me how any young lady should be able to grasp the speciality of soldiers under the circumstances delineated in this painting." Well, it was not stopped there. Florence Nightingale, who'd of course had turned over the medical establishment in the Crimea War, had insisted on changes in medicine, insisted on the hospitals being kept clean, on nurses being a dominant force. Asked for the painting to be brought. She was sick at the time, and she asked for this painting to be brought to her home so she could view it. Queen Victoria also asked for it to be brought to her home. And remember I told you how it was a commission for £100 by Galloway? Well, Galloway agreed to sell it to her. He agreed that he said, well, you have to paint me your next painting. I want your next painting, and I want the copyright on it. He renegotiated the deal. And remember, he paid Elizabeth £100 for it. He renegotiated the deal, and Queen Victoria paid £1,000 for it. Well, the paintings then toured throughout Europe. But while it was touring throughout Britain, men walked around with sandwich boards saying, "The roll call is coming." Men throughout all the cities. Can you imagine the scene? Strange, different times, another country. In Liverpool, 20,000 people saw the painting in 3 weeks, and 250,000 cards of the painting sold. So here's just Elizabeth was obsessed with detail. She was an amateur historian, but she went out and she found soldiers that had fought in these campaigns, and she brought them into her studio and painted them and drew them. She also interviewed men at length. So this was to be her next painting. You remember Charles Galloway had asked that her next painting directly came to him. And this was to be the one. Once again, she was allowed to choose the subject. And she wrote of this one, "I wish to show what an English square looks like when viewed quite close at the end of 2 hours' action when about to receive a last charge. A cool speech, seeing I've never seen the thing, and yet I seem to have seen it. The hot blackened faces, the set teeth, the gaping mouths, the bloodshot eyes, the mocking laughter of the young men, indeed boys, the stern, cool, calculating look here and there, the unquestionable, dogged stare." This is a scene from the Napoleonic Wars. The crafty Corsican had escaped from Elba, and he'd sailed around France. He'd raised an army, and he was set to take Europe again. Wellington's army crossed the seas and was to meet him in Europe. This was the day before Waterloo. So you can imagine war was looming, knocking at Britain's gate again. The British would have been, the papers would have been full of it. The British would have been on tenterhooks. It was in the zeitgeist of the time. This was a terrible shadow hanging over Britain as far as the British were concerned. And at Quatre Bras, Napoleon's forces were meeting Wellington's. And the day before Waterloo, to be honest with you, Napoleon had Wellington he had him on the back foot. Wellington, there was said to be a situation when Wellington was chased by the French forces, and he barely escaped with his life. The British forces met at Quatre Bras, and there was this battle, and the French forces were held back, but barely. You know, at the end of the day, it was the battle was undecided. This is a tactic tactic that the British were famous for at the time, and like another colonial power, they'd taken it from the Romans, and it's called the square. And what it involved was a square, men drawn up in a square. And cavalry was a tactic of the armies then, and a cavalry charge of anything from 100 to 1,000 men would come down on the infantry, bang, and it would lead to massive loss of life and carnage on both sides. But here we see the Polish cavalry coming in after the day's fighting. And they're worn thin. You know, this has been a whole day of furious fighting. And the British are keeping them at bay with this square, because a cavalry, it would come head on, they would meet the guns. So they might come around to the side to pick off men at the side. But there's a square, they couldn't get there. But they then might come around behind, but there's a square, they can't get there. And the British also used this tactic of fire, reload, fire, reload, fire, reload. So it was like this impenetrable war of gunfire. There were, I believe, 27 moves described in the military tactics book. 27 moves for a man to carry out this formation. And the British were famed for it. Napoleon's forces, of course, were less disciplined. And British forces were often, they took the king's shilling, the queen's shilling, which meant if you took the shilling, you were in. And often men were tricked into taking the shilling. Whereas the French was the Republic, and men in the French army, Napoleon's armies, they were volunteers. So they were less disciplined. And it was said the British were so close together in case any snuck off. As always, Elizabeth had painstaking attention to detail. She was absolutely obsessed with it. She travelled first of all to Henley, and there was ryegrass there, and this is the ryegrass. And she got children to stamp, local children were playing there, and she got them to stamp it all down and tread it all down. Here are the faces of some of the children, and perhaps she used them as models, and she got them to trample it down. She painted there, set up her easel there in Henley. She then travelled to Sanger's Circus and painted the horses there. She got the equestrian there to hold down the horses like so. So she could capture the movement of when they're down and they're struggling to get up. You know, she was that obsessed with detail. She also visited the horse barracks at Knightsbridge, and she used for this painting, a lot of policemen were used, because policemen were not allowed to grow facial hair. And soldiers, of course, did, you know, the cold of battle and the inability to shave when they were on active engagement. She also, by this stage, everybody in Britain and Europe had heard of her, the first female war painter. And so the army was laying out the red carpet for her. They recognised the propagandists when they saw one. And they actually arranged for 300 men to be on, to be carrying out manoeuvres, and she painted these men, and she was allowed to have 8 men who came to her studio bristling with guns, and she painted them there. She entered it for the Royal Academy, and it was exhibited, and it was accepted and exhibited. John Ruskin, a famous critic of his day, said, "I've always said a woman cannot paint, but it is Amazon's work, this." Imagine how she must have felt. And the insults went on. The Royal Academy did not exhibit it in room 2. They did not exhibit it on the line. They put it in a room at the back of the Academy. It was known amongst painters as the Black Hole, It was the black hole because there was no light there. So if your painting was exhibited there, the public couldn't see it really. They couldn't see the detail. If you're a painter and you've spent morning till night working on the detail of painting, nevertheless, it was suggested that she might now become a Royal Academician. And indeed, she was put forward for membership of the Royal Academy. Turned down. She lost out by 2 notes. Now, no woman was to become a Royal Academician till 1936, when Laura Knight achieved that honour. By the way, the painting was mobbed. She said, I went to view the painting and it was mobbed. Okay, so this next painting is Balaclava. And Balaclava, of course, was one of the Crimean Wars. And I hate to tell you about the history of the Balaclava. It was Russia seeking to make gains in the Crimean Peninsula and just around the Ukraine. Britain was fighting against this. Russia attacked Balaclava. They were hoping to cut off the supplies that the British Army needed. This is the remnants of the charge of the Light Brigade. So you remember the charge of the Light Brigade, this awful situation at Balaclava when men were sent into a small valley, and the Light Brigade were sent in, and there were Russian guns at the end of the valley. There were Russian guns flanking the Light Brigade as they went in on both sides. So it was basically a suicide mission. As the Light Brigade sounds, they were not a heavy brigade. They were not capable of winning this. They went in because a soldier is taught to obey commands, no matter the consequences. It's said that it was because of, it's all very muddled, and historians have always been unhappy to discuss it really, because it seems that high up in command and down through the command, for whatever reason, the right command didn't get through. The Light Brigade charged in and were, of course, completely slaughtered. They were slaughtered. 666 men went in and 220 or so came out. Terrible day in British history. And here Elizabeth painted them as victims of this terrible situation. You can see the men are just decimated. This man's reaching out. They're on the ground here. This guy, he was actually an actor. And it really was most unfortunate because Elizabeth was accused of basically putting too much emotion into this painting by the critics. They said, this isn't a done thing. British soldiers don't have trauma. They don't exhibit madness or this dazed, horrified look. Yes, the Manchester critic said, we think it would have been well if you, Mr. Pennington, had never come back from the charge. What cruel times. This man had been through the charge of the Light Brigade, and that was published publicly. You are theatrical, not dramatic, ruinously obtrusive and unreal. Well, the Fine Arts Gallery paid £3,000 for the copyright of this painting, and it was a great success. 100,000 visitors viewed it on tour. There's the story of, as I say, she interviewed, she always put veterans as the models for her paintings. And there's the story, she had a colonel modelling for this painting, and when she was working on the drawing, he marched up to the painting and he started to scrub out their headwear. And he's saying they didn't wear those caps. They didn't wear those caps. And she was distraught. She thought, oh, now what do I do? And then a sergeant, who was also modelling, said to her, "Ma'am, as far as I can recall, I went into the charge wearing a skull cap and I came out wearing a skull cap." So, yeah. Next painting. This again, the Crimea. Now, this is, I found that Elizabeth Thompson, still Elizabeth Thompson at this stage, she often seemed to return to motives that she painted, to motifs that she painted. Remember the first painting, the roll call, that she was admired for the restraint that she exhibited in showing these wounded men. Well, here we have, this is once again the Crimea, and this time this is the victorious army returning from the battle. I believe that's Sevastopol in the background, and the British had pushed the Russians back from Sevastopol, beyond Sevastopol. And here, these two men, they're carrying a wounded soldier. We have this one officer on his charge, this wounded man looking up to him. But basically, we see men just destitute. And the incredible thing about this painting is the individuals. You know, she, as I say, she used veterans, and these men they're all individuals. They're all wounded. They're all in a terrible state. I believe, actually, I suspect, around about this time, she met her husband, William Butler. And I've always thought that this man is William Butler. I might be wrong, but it does look a bit like him. And I always like to think that he became her muse. You know. This is William Butler. He joined up in Ireland. He was from a impoverished Irish aristocratic family. He managed to scrape enough money together to join an Irish regiment. He joined as a captain. Then, of course, you bought your way into the army. You bought your commission. He joined as a captain. He rose to a general and then became a baronet and was involved in British politics. Now this man was extraordinary. They really made quite a couple. He himself was a celebrity, not least because he was constantly criticising Britain for its colonial policies, constantly asking for there to be reforms in the military. During the Zulu campaign, the African Wars, the Zulu campaigns, he was accused by other officers of preferring the company of Zulus to them. And he was actually a close friend of the Zulu king. And when Caswell was imprisoned, he actually brought him supplies to ease his incarceration. He also, being an Irishman and having witnessed himself the Irish treatment by the British over the tenancies, the evictions that had been going on, he was a great proponent of Home Rule, and he was always pushing for Home Rule in Ireland. So, of course, this didn't always make him popular, but he was universally acknowledged to be an exceptional soldier and general. He was always loyal to the Crown and to the army. An essayist, his book is still in ink, I believe. They were quite a couple. As I said, they sort of became the celebrity couple. And when she met him, actually, it basically it led to really her career started to diminish, because even though she was this feminist, She believed in, as I say, she was very strict Catholic, and she believed in the family. And she believed that a woman should be at home looking after the family. Of course, she'd married a soldier, and so she also often had to follow the soldier on various posts that he had. She never went into battle. But she certainly went to Africa and to Egypt and throughout Europe with him at various times, and certainly in Britain she travelled with him. But they moved to Ireland, and of course when she moved to Ireland she was no longer in the eye of the artistic establishment, and so she was no longer getting commissions. So yeah, as I say, her career started to get on the back foot. But there we go. That's life. Life intervenes for artists, does it not? Here we have now Lady Elizabeth Butler. Now this is it's a lovely picture of her. So her and William went on honeymoon, and they went to Ireland. And he did actually offer her, she said, would you like to go to Ireland or Europe? And she diplomatically said, oh, Ireland. You know. And she was commissioned when she got married. And once again, she could paint what she wanted. This painting is with the Berry Art Gallery. And while she was in Kerry, with her husband William, she started work on this painting. Kerry's a beautiful part of Ireland, and you know she did capture the wildness of Ireland and the lovely light. Sorry, this painting is called Listed for the Connaught Rangers. It's painted in 1878. These British soldiers in their red jackets, here's the recruiting sergeant and the boy soldiers. This young man with his drum on his shoulder, the weight of it. This young man with the regimental dog. This young man seems to be lighting a cigarette, or perhaps he's playing a pipe. I think he's having a quick smoke. And these two guys were Kerry men that Elizabeth met, and they're dressed in. I hope you can see they're dressed in these corduroy slacks, these hats that were sort of obviously commonly worn in Kerry at the time. But it's no honeymoon idyll. Yeah, it was regarded by the Royal Academy as a great piece of propaganda. But in fact, you can see the man on the right looking to the side at the cottage. And the cottage is in ruins. And he's leaving Kerry, and he's going off with the British Army, and he must be thinking, is this to be my life? Am I to sack the indigenous population's cottages? Am I to turn them out as they have done to my people? Well, if so, if this was what she was saying, the Royal Academy didn't notice it, they exhibited it. I think also it must have been autobiographical, because she just married into the army, and she was now walking into the soldier's life. You know, she knew she was going to have children, and they no doubt would grow up to be soldiers. So it must have been quite a moment for her. Not least she knew she would be leaving behind this career that had exploded on the world stage. So I'm going to show you a painting now, her other Irish painting. This was actually painted just over 10 years later. And once again, she seems to be returning to a motif. Once again, this painting is called The Eviction. And it was painted in 1890. It hangs in the University College, Dublin. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy, didn't sell. It's obviously a non-military painting, but it's dealing with violence, as all Elizabeth paintings were. We see the evicted woman, barefoot. Her house has been destroyed, pulled down. Around her are scattered possessions. And she looks off, and behind here we see the soldiers in black uniforms retreating. Elizabeth said of this in her sketchbook, "I set up my easel there, and the evicted woman came to search among the ashes of her home to try and find some of her belongings intact." She was very philosophical and did not rise to the level of my indignation. And this is what we see in all her paintings, is the stoic suffering of the men of the rank and file of the indigenous populations of Europe. These people who were put through these terrible situations through necessity, really, let's face it. And yet they carried with them this stoic acceptance of their fate. Ironically enough, Elizabeth was actually thrown out of her own house by the Republican Army and in the Irish Troubles. And her house was burnt. And I always wondered if the Republicans were aware of this painting. But anyway, there we go. There's some kind of some strange karma there. So next painting. Well, this is her largest painting. Of course, you can go and see this in the Tate. It's called The Remnants of an Army. It's at the Tate, Britain. And it shows another terrible defeat of the British Army. On this occasion, it was once again involving the Russians. The Russians were now on the Afghan border. They were making alliances on the Afghan border, and Britain was terrified that the Russians were going to come south into India and start infringing on the Indian colony. And so they rushed a force out immediately. They met the Russian force, and it was a tragedy. It really was a tragedy. 16,000 men were in the battle at Kabul, and at the time, this fort at Jellalabad, this was believed to be the sole survivor of those 16,000 men. In fact, there were a few more, with negotiations to get back prisoners and so forth, and a few more men did turn up. But this was the first survivor. And this was Dr. William Bryden. He was a surgeon with the Bengal Lancers. And he's clinging to his horse. The horse, poor horse, looks like its legs are broken. He's barely conscious. And he's coming up to the gates of Jellalabad, and here there's a trooper riding out to meet him to hear of this terrible, terrible slaughter. So this was the first war in Afghan, and Lady Elizabeth started to paint this on when the second war started. Once again, because of the same reason the Russians were pushing in Afghanistan, and she painted it because she said, "This new Afghan war revived for me the tragedy of 1842." And her husband said, "The favourite theory of the Forward School that the Afghans have only to be freely shot, plundered, and otherwise knocked about to become our firm and fast allies and hate the Russians with something of the fervour of a music hall audience." So they were both talking out against the Second Afghan War. At the time, the British public actually saw this painting. They were like, "Right, we're going to revenge this. We're up for this." And the painting was a great success. Just a year later, the Second War, was a disaster for Britain, and it was a very difficult peace that had to be made with Afghanistan. Meanwhile, back at the RA, it was exhibited at the RA, and on this occasion, Elizabeth was up for election to be a member of the Royal Academy. And Punch actually wrote, "The painting of the year, let us write Mrs. Butler, RA." Really admirable. So, once again, all the ladies in London must have been so excited. We're going to be allowed into the RA. And the men must have been furious and marching up and down. We can't have this. The ladies taking over again. And, Elizabeth must have been really pleased with the situation. Things were kicking off again. And but no, she was to be turned down by the Academy. And this was the last time she would be nominated during her lifetime. So, here we have Elizabeth at her most violent. You can imagine, as I say, no film, no TV. You walk into a gallery and you're confronted by this massive painting, the full weight of the scarlet devils coming down upon you. Their horses, their teeth biting at the bit, teeth as if to bite the viewers, spit flying from their mouth, their golden manes flying behind them. On top of them, these men in their red devils, chopping swords held high. Very violent painting, for its time, a painting for its time. And a remarkable painting as well. And also you actually see, I hope I won't bore the non-painters here, but as far as a painting goes, the design is pretty untouchable in this painting as the way of coming up with a design for painting. Because what she actually used was an arrow. She used an arrow for the design. So you'll see this arrow. You see, we've got this arrow. So you've got an arrow coming at you out of the painting. You've got foreshortening, so the horse's head's coming out of the painting at you. And the hooves, of course, in a charge, you wouldn't see the hooves, but she's got the hooves frozen and once again abnormally large, which creates this effect of the horses coming out of the painting. In this painting, she forgoes the need to paint caricature. She was often said she has the ability of her paintings are Hogarthian in their use of character. But here, there isn't a great deal of character shown in the men's faces. They're all pretty much the same. But these red devils riding the horses and their chopping swords held high. The chopping swords are also in an arrow that meet above here Colonel Hamilton's head. Now this is Colonel Hamilton leading the charge, and the swords are like so. And you'll also see in the grooves of the ground, the grooves are coming out and leading into the arrow. So it was a very, very well executed painting. Charge of the Scots Greys. This was at Waterloo. We saw the first painting that I showed you after the roll call, which was Quatre Bras, the square. That was the first painting of violence, really. This is another one and there were others too, but I don't really. They're not as high caliber paintings as I believe this one to be. This was at Waterloo, and it was on it was early on in the battle, and on the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's forces were meeting Wellington's forces. Still, it was in the balance of who would be victorious in this battle, and the Scots Greys were ordered upon the French artillery. Now, the French artillery, here is the plain of Waterloo, and the French artillery were on the left, and they were bombing They were using cannon and musket fire down on the British forces and really wasting them. So Wellington ordered the charge. Supposedly the Scots Greys picked their way through the infantry, and another Scottish regiment shouted up to them, "Scotland the brave! Scotland forever!" I'm sure they didn't cough. They probably did actually, being soldiers, but soldiers no tobacco. But they shouted out "Scotland forever" at the men, and then the men broke into a canter and then a charge, and they came down upon the French forces, and they smashed them. And with their the British had heavy chopping swords, and they brought them down heavy on the necks and the heads of the infantry and the artillery. And they showed no mercy. The boy musicians there, the French boy musicians, smashed, and it was all looking good. It was all looking good for the British as far as war was concerned. But the British soldiers became drunk on the wine of battle, and they stayed amongst the artillery to kill. And the French regrouped and came back at them, and it was the British turn now to be slaughtered. So here we have that charge. Of course, it's said that this charge led to Wellington being able to dominate the field and go on to victory. So in the great scheme of things, they gave their lives for victory. But at what cost? And this is really the theme that you see in all of Elizabeth's paintings, is at what cost to the rank and file did these wars in Europe cost? On this occasion, this very famous occasion, she travelled to Aldershot, and she actually got 300 men on horseback to actually set up a charge. And they actually charged at her, and she actually set up an easel, was happily drawing away. And apparently these men on horses, these soldiers, armed to the teeth, pulled up literally 10, 20 feet away from her. Extraordinary. So I'm going on a bit, but this is the last painting. And once again, I speak about how Elizabeth would return to motives that she painted, and she seemed to often be saying, actually, let me paint it like this. Let me show you this side of the battle. This is actually what I feel. And here we have the dawn of Waterloo. And I suspect that figure actually to be Wellington. It looks like Wellington. But here we have the field of men on Waterloo. And the morning they've woken up, we see the embers of a fire. The men, the troopers blowing the reveille. Wake up, boys! And here this man's looking out, and he's looking into the eyes of death. This guy, he's still asleep. He almost seems to be being cradled in his friend's arm. He's still asleep. He's but a boy. This man, he's reaching for his friend, and his friend seems dead. It's almost a preempt of what's to come for many of the men of Waterloo. The Caravaggio comes to mind when I look at this painting, just because of the use of colour. Caravaggio often in his paintings, his predominant colour was red, scarlet. Scarlet blood. Caravaggio's painting is full of violence as well. And here we see the men in their red tunics, and it's contrasted against the dark of the morning. But of course the painting, another painterly technique, the painting is divided in two. You have the light and the dark. So we have this double thing going on with the painting, and these two men silhouetted against the light. Once again, this painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy. It was not given a great place at all. And by this stage, Elizabeth was actually was being ignored, really. I think that my personal opinion of it, which I think is common sense, is that the male establishment really had grown a little bit tired of Elizabeth and her antics, her paintings rather, and they sort of, they didn't really want to whip, the newspapers didn't want to whip the British public up anymore into this kind of, oh, is she, isn't she, are women coming, are they not? They really ignored her. And as I say, this painting was largely ignored, although I think it's one of her greatest paintings. And it's now in the National Army Museum, and there was quite a bidding war over it. As I say, the National Army Museum were determined to get this painting. It hangs now in the National Army Museum. So there we go. I chose some which I consider to be some of her most extraordinary dramatic paintings. I've tried to show to you, and I hope I've made it clear how, yes, Elizabeth was a painter of her time. She was working for the colonial man, but she was more than that. She was more than just a propagandist, as she was regarded by the establishment. She was a social realist, and she carries a warning for society now. Who suffers war? The people, the indigenous people, the rank and file. There's no glory in it, and there's little in the territorial gains, really. Thank you very much. Thank you.